Helena woke up to the sound of wood crackling. The wind battered against the east wall of the cabin as if pushing everything inside. The temperature was already close to 60 degrees, and the air escaping through an old crack was so cold it felt like it was cutting through her skin. She sat up slowly, feeling her knees stiff, and reached for the thick blanket she kept by her bed for these early mornings of extreme wind. Her breath came out thin, almost without vapor, a sign that the inside was starting to cool down quickly. She lit the lamp, watched the flame flicker, and heard a familiar sound, the outer canvas flapping loudly. It was the kind of noise that announced a sudden change in the weather. Helena put on her heavy boots, adjusted her coat, and opened the door just enough to look out into the courtyard. The darkness was dense. Snow flew horizontally, carried by continuous gusts. The sheep pen was only a few meters away, but at that moment she could barely see the stakes. She closed the door and picked up a metal bucket. She collected snow that had accumulated near the stove, using her gloved hands to clear away the hard crust that had formed there. She placed the bucket on the stove to melt the ice. She would need hot water to keep the sheep comfortable and also to warm her own hands a little during the night. While waiting for the ice to melt, she heard a distant howl. It wasn't the first one that week. The pack usually appeared when food was scarce on the plains. The problem was that in the last 2 nights, the howls had come closer. She knew that the storm was pushing the animals into protected areas, and the sheepfold ended up being a point of interest. Helena opened the door again, now with the short torch she kept by the entrance. The wind almost blew the fire out, but she managed to protect it with her hand. She walked slowly to the fence, her boots sinking into the soft snow. Each step required strength in her hips. The sheepfold was intact. The sheep moved little, huddled together, feeling the pressure of the wind. She ran her hand over the top wire and noticed accumulated ice, which made the structure heavier and more vulnerable. She reinforced 2 ties with small knots, tightening the ropes stiffened by the cold. She heard the wind again blowing over the shed roof, a long sound reminiscent of wood being twisted. The storm was just beginning. Upon returning to the cabin, she replaced the torch in its holder and checked the stove. The embers were alive. She pushed 2 pieces of dry wood into the center, watching them crackle immediately. Then she placed a cloth over the pot of hot water, preventing it from cooling while she dealt with other tasks. Before sitting down, she heard another howl. This time, it was closer. There were no footsteps in the snow yet, but Helena recognized the rhythm of the approach. The pack seemed scattered, moving around the grounds. She took a deep breath, adjusted her coat, and listened. The wood crackled again, and the wind intensified its impact on the west facade. The storm had truly arrived. When the faint light of dawn came through the crack in the window, Helena realized that the storm had not let up. The wind continued to blow steadily, pushing snow against the north wall of the cabin. She breathed in the icy air that had accumulated inside and put on her coat, still stiff from the early morning cold. She grabbed the lamp, opened the door with effort, and felt the immediate blow of the frozen gust on her face. Visibility was poor. Even so, Helena made her way to the sheepfold. The accumulated snow was almost knee-deep, forcing her to lift her legs with force. The air seemed heavier than the day before. As she approached the fence, she stopped. There were marks in the snow, extending in a semicircle. The footprints were fresh, deep, wide enough to leave no doubt. The pack had passed through there before dawn. Helena crouched down, resting her gloved hand on the wire to keep her balance. She ran her finger along the edge of the footprint. The ice had not yet hardened completely. That meant little time had passed since the last passage. The sheep were agitated. She heard small bleats muffled by the wind. She walked along the fence, observing each pressure point on the wood. 2 spots were more smelly, probably the result of a combination of gusts and the animals' attempts to get closer. She returned to the cabin to get tools. She chose a sturdy rope, 2 short stakes, and a piece of wood she had saved for possible repairs. She also gathered 3 logs of firewood. She walked back to the pen with the weight distributed in her arms, keeping a steady pace so as not to slip on the uneven surface. When she reached the first vulnerable spot, she stuck the stakes into the hardened snow, tilting them to support the weakest section of the fence. Then she tightened the rope in short turns until she felt the whole thing stabilize. At the second point, she fitted the board inside the pen, reinforcing the part that had been forced open during the night. She paused. The wind carried a low sound, coming from the hills. It wasn't a howl, but something between the movement and breathing of the storm itself. Helena looked back and saw the trail of her own footsteps being quickly covered. She would need to work faster. She decided to make a longer torch for the afternoon inspection. She returned to the cabin, prepared a piece of cloth soaked in oil, and tied it to the end of a sturdy branch. She left the torch leaning against the door, ready for use. Then she threw snow into a small pot, lit the fire with 2 pieces of dry wood, and watched the ice begin to melt. She would need this hot water to keep her hands functional when the temperature dropped even further. A howl sounded suddenly, short and direct. Helena turned her face toward the sound. The pack was closer than it had seemed in the morning. She closed the door firmly, checked that the lock was secure, and rested her hand on the door frame for a few seconds, listening to the wind beating against the roof. The threat was gathering around the property, and she knew that this would only be the first approach of the day. In the middle of the afternoon, the wind slowed down for a few minutes, and this brief silence caught Helena's attention. Strong storms often created quick pauses before worsening again. She was standing by the stove, heating water in a small metal mug, when she heard a crash coming from the direction of the sheep pen. It wasn't the sound of the wind pushing wood. It was something more concentrated, drier, like a direct impact. Helena placed the mug next to the fire, put on her coat without closing it completely, and picked up the long torch she had prepared. When she opened the door, the light barely penetrated the curtain of suspended snow. Even so, she moved forward slowly. The trail to the sheepfold was partially covered. With each step, her foot sank a few centimeters before finding firm ground. The cold was so intense that the air seemed to tear at her lungs. The sheep pen loomed like an irregular shadow. The sheep moved restlessly. Helena raised the torch to increase the range of light and walked along the right side of the fence. That's when she heard another noise, this time closer, wood being pressed. She quickened her pace, feeling her heart beat faster, and found the source of the sound. On the outside of the fence, near the corner where the oldest stakes joined, there was a small opening created by the displacement of one of the boards. The snow around it was churned up. The marks were clear. Large paws, 4 repeated prints in a sideways motion. The pack had tested the spot, probably minutes before. Helena knelt, holding the torch tightly so that the wind would not extinguish the flame. She placed her gloved hand on the loose wood and felt the stiff cold of the material. The board was giving way due to wear and tear, not just the pressure of the animals. She needed to reinforce it immediately. She returned to the cabin to fetch a wider board, a handful of medium-sized stones, and 2 short pieces of wire. When she returned, the wind had picked up. Her hands trembled more from the cold than from the effort, but she continued without pause. First, she positioned the stones at the base of the fence, creating weight to prevent them from pushing underneath. Then, she adjusted the wire around the new board, tightening it with her fingers until she felt enough resistance. The process required small, controlled movements, and the feeling of the metal tip touching the extreme cold burned her skin through the fabric. The sheep remained restless. With each crack, they moved closer to the center of the pen. Helena raised the torch and looked around. The storm had become even more aggressive. Small whirlwinds of snow formed on the ground, pushed by the wind in rapid trajectories. No shadow of a wolf was visible, but the atmosphere carried that silent tension of when something approaches without showing itself. Before returning to the cabin, Helena ran her hand along the reinforced wire, testing to see if any points were still vibrating in the wind. Nothing gave way. She took a few steps back, looked at the makeshift structure, and took a deep breath. The cold seemed to penetrate her coat, but at least for now, the pen was protected. As she turned to return, a short howl cut through the air. It didn't come from the hills this time. It came from nearby, perhaps behind the shed, a clear sign that the reinforcement would not be enough for long. The howl that came from behind the shed made Helena stop for a few seconds. The wind couldn't disperse the sound. It was close, direct, as if the animal was circling a few meters away. She held the torch more firmly and slowly advanced along the side of the sheepfold. The snow hit her face, making it difficult to keep her eyes open. Still, she looked for any shadow or movement at the edge of her visibility. When she turned the corner of the shed, she didn't see the wolf, but she found new tracks in the snow. The footprints were fresh, aligned, indicating that the animal was patrolling the area. Helena bent down to get a better look. The wind formed small waves of snow around the tracks, but had not yet erased them. She raised her head and listened carefully. Another howl answered from further away, and then a third, deeper one, coming from the opposite direction. The pack seemed to have spread out in a wide arc around the property. She returned to the cabin with quicker steps. She needed to prepare the perimeter before daylight disappeared. Upon entering, she closed the door firmly and placed the torch on the holder. She grabbed 3 logs, a bundle of cloth, the container of oil, and 2 ropes. She assembled a long torch and left 2 more ready, tied to the doorframe so she could light them quickly if necessary. The wind was so strong that the roof began to creak in short bursts, as if the accumulated ice were pulling the shingles down. Helena heated water in a leather bag. She kept it on the stove until she felt it was hot enough to prevent her fingers from losing sensitivity. Then she put the bag inside her coat, pressed against her chest, and adjusted the layers of fabric around her neck. The temperature was plummeting, and every minute lost would make any action outside more difficult. She opened the door carefully. The impact of the wind almost knocked over one of the prepared torches. She picked up the lit torch and advanced again toward the sheepfold. The sheep were huddled in the center. Some stamped their hooves on the frozen ground, trying to keep warm. Around them, shadows passed between gusts, too fast to identify complete shapes. Helena turned her body slowly, following any sign. The noise of the wind made it difficult to distinguish between footsteps and crackling, but at certain moments she noticed the slight displacement of snow caused by low movements typical of circling wolves. She decided to set up an improvised perimeter. She stuck 2 of the unlit torches into the snow, a few meters away from the fence. Then she lit each one, using the main flame. The light flickered, almost blown away by the wind, but remained steady enough to create an illuminated strip that would make it difficult for the pack to approach directly. She then separated some medium-sized stones she had left near the shed. She kept 4 inside her coat for immediate use. The tension grew silently. The shadows continued to appear at brief intervals, always near the points where the fence had previously given way. It was clear that the animals were testing again. When a louder crack sounded in the west corner of the pen, Helena turned abruptly. The torch illuminated only the dust of snow that had been kicked up. No animals were visible, but she knew they were there, getting closer and closer, waiting for the right moment to advance. When night finally took over the land, the light from the torches became the only stable point in the middle of the storm. The wind gained strength in long gusts, dragging snow against the fences and drowning out any distant noise. Helena stood still for a few seconds, watching the flame flicker. She had to keep the torch lit at all costs. Without it, there would be no way to ward off the pack. The sheep bleated irregularly, as if they sensed something approaching that she could not yet see. The crackling in the west corner of the pen sounded again, louder this time. Helena walked quickly in that direction, holding the torch with her arm outstretched. The snow swirled in small eddies, obscuring her vision. She raised her head and heard the distinct sound of wood giving way. Suddenly, 2 shadows crossed the outer strip lit by the torches stuck in the snow. Low, fast, steady movements. One of the wolves stopped for a moment, remaining almost motionless. Its eyes reflected the torchlight with a brief glint before disappearing behind the wall of blown snow. Helena moved her body closer to the fence and realized that part of the wood was giving way inward. The pressure came from the outside, insistent, as if several animals were pushing at the same time. She took a deep breath, raised the torch, and took another step forward. The wind almost blew out the flame, but she tilted the torch to protect it. With her other hand, she grabbed one of the stones she had stored in her coat. She threw it toward the shadows. The impact on the snow created a sharp sound, and a short growl responded almost immediately. Then another wolf crossed the illuminated area, now closer to the weakened opening. The wood gave way completely, opening a narrow space. The sheep retreated to the center, pressed tightly against each other. Helena approached the gap and pushed one of the reinforced stakes, trying to block the passage. The wind slipped through her fingers, now stiffer despite the hot water bottle tucked under her coat. She felt the tip of the wire vibrate. She had to act fast. Another shadow appeared closer than before. The wolf advanced halfway, trying to force the opening. Helena raised the torch and brought the flame close to the animal's snout, which retreated a few inches but did not run away. The tension increased. The wind swayed, almost extinguishing the fire. She shielded the torch with her hand and threw another stone with a short, direct effort. The animal jumped back, but there were more of them circling. The corner of the fence began to give way on the opposite side as well. The pack was testing 2 points at the same time. Helena realized that if she didn't block the opening quickly, she would lose control of the entire pen. She bent down, picked up a thin board she kept near the shed for emergencies, and wedged the piece of wood into the gap. The wind pushed against her, making any movement difficult. Still, she managed to lock the base with compressed snow and small stones, creating a makeshift block. The torch trembled, the shadows continued to prowl, and the night was far from over. The makeshift barrier held for a few minutes, but Helena knew it wouldn't last long. The pressure on the fence alternated from one side to the other. Each impact made the wood vibrate as if it were about to break. The torch she held lost height as it burned, making the flame more sensitive to the wind. The heat was diminishing. Her hands were beginning to go numb. She took a few steps back and looked around, trying to identify something that could serve as a more resistant barrier. The old sled was leaning against the side of the shed, partially covered by accumulated snow. It was heavy, made of solid wood, with runners worn down by years of use. Dragging it to the sheepfold would require continuous strength, but it would be the best chance to block the passage. Helena ran to the sled, sinking almost to her shins with each step. The snow was denser, hardened by the constant fall of fine crystals. When she reached the sled, she removed the accumulated snow with her gloved hands and grabbed the sidebar. The initial weight almost made her shoulder give way, but she adjusted her body, steadied her feet, and began to pull. The sound of the sled dragging across the ice echoed between gusts, creating a harsh noise that contrasted with the howls that were returning at the edge of visibility. The pack's approach became clear when a shadow quickly crossed behind the shed. She didn't stop. She continued pulling the sled to the weakened corner of the fence. The sheep huddled closer together in the center, sensing the growing tension. The wind pushed snow against Helena's face, accumulating a thin layer on her eyebrows and the hood of her coat. When she reached the opening, she placed the torch on the ground, wedged between 2 rocks, and turned the sled on its side. She pushed hard to fit it into the space where the wood still gave way. The impact made the structure vibrate. She adjusted the positioning, placed a large rock behind the lower runner, and pulled a rope from her coat. She secured the sled to the main fence post, tightening the knot until she felt the hardened fiber give slightly under the force of the extreme cold. Suddenly, a loud growl erupted behind her. Helena quickly turned around and saw one of the wolves advance a few meters before stopping at the edge lit by the torch. The light flickered, but it still kept the animal hesitant. She took another stone from her coat and threw it with short precision. The sound of the impact startled the wolf, but 2 others appeared right behind it, circling in short, calculated movements. The pack seemed to be testing her courage as much as the strength of the structures. The sled blocked the passage, but not completely. The base needed to be more solid. Helena knelt down and began to push compacted snow around the skate, using her hands as shovels. The pain in her fingers increased. The fabric of her glove was already damp and beginning to harden. Even so, she continued. She pressed the snow until it formed a solid base. Then she reinforced the sides with 2 smaller stones. The pack advanced once more. One of the wolves even placed its front paw on the edge of the barrier, but retreated when Helena raised the torch again, bringing the flame closer. The attack lasted for long minutes, always starting again when the wind died down. But little by little, the howls began to fade away. The shadows became less frequent. The tension eased, though it did not disappear completely. The sled remained steady, and she, exhausted, still had to cross the heavy snow before she could rest. When the howls finally disappeared, the wind was still blowing strongly, but more evenly. There were no longer those irregular gusts that announced the movement of the pack. Helena stood still for a few moments beside the sled, holding the torch too low, almost extinguished. The small flame flickered as if it were tired too. She raised her arm, shielding the fire with her hand, and breathed slowly. Her whole body was shaking. The icy air entered through the gaps in her coat and clung to her skin, leaving her breath short and heavy. The sheep remained huddled together. The storm muffled any sound, but it was possible to hear small movements inside the pen. Helena took 2 steps back, testing the strength of the blockage. The wood of the sled did not give way. The rope was taut, stiff, stuck as if it had frozen in the shape of the knot. The stones around it remained in place. Nothing indicated immediate danger. She ran her gloved hand along the edge of the fence just to feel the slight vibration caused by the wind. There was no pressure coming from outside. The torch was coming to an end. The flame was beginning to shrink. Helena crouched down, carefully picked up the torch, and extinguished the fire against the snow, preserving the wick for another day. Then she gathered the stones she had used to support the light and put them in the side pocket of her coat. The gesture was almost automatic. It was what she always did. Save everything that could be used again. The return to the cabin required slow strength. The snow hit her legs, and the ground seemed heavier than on the way there. Her body responded with delay. Each step seemed to require more effort than necessary. The cabin door was partially covered by accumulated snow, pushed by the wind. Helena cleared enough to reach the latch, opened a narrow space, and entered. The air inside was cold. The fire had died down considerably. The embers were still alive, but almost hidden under the ashes. Helena knelt beside the stove, pushed the gray layer aside with a piece of metal, and found enough heat to revive the fire. She put 2 small chips in first, waiting until she heard crackling. Then she added another piece of wood, larger, watching the flame grow slowly. She took off her gloves and brought her hands close to the heat. The sensation was burning, as if the blood was returning to her fingers with difficulty. Even so, she kept her hands there, feeling the stiffness gradually diminish. Then she took off her heavy coat, left it by the door, and sat on the short bench next to the stove. Her breathing was still rapid, but it was beginning to deepen. For a few minutes, she just stared at the flames. The sound of the wind outside was still strong, but it seemed less aggressive now. The structure of the cabin creaked from time to time, reminding her that the weight of the ice was still there, pressing down on the wood. Even so, there was a kind of restfulness in those dry notes from the roof. When she finally got up, she took the metal pot and collected some snow that had come in through the crack in the door. She put it on the stove to melt. The hot water would help her body recover before bed. While she waited, she listened to the silence beyond the walls. No howling, no footsteps, just the wind, keeping the night alive. Helena drank the hot water slowly. Then she turned off the lamp, lay down near the stove, and remained there, feeling the heat reach her face. The next day would bring new tasks, but for now, there was only the fire, her breathing, and the end of the storm. If you enjoyed this story full of courage and adventure, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any extreme adventures.